everyone. Great to be here today, and thank you very much to our fantastic organizers. I'm Ishana Ratan, a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley and former predoctoral fellow with the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And today I'll be sharing a talk based on my job market paper. I am on the job market. And I'll be talking a little bit today about how renewable energy firms shape policymaking and ultimately long-term outcomes for the energy transition. Now, we might expect that countries which rely on foreign investment will scale up quickly and lead the energy transition in the developing world. Foreign companies have technology, skills, and capital that domestic firms might not have on their own. However, to preview my argument, I find that countries reliant on foreign investment experience a boom and bust in solar investment, while those with more domestic firms scale up slower, but more steadily in the long term. Now, I attribute these puzzling results to firms' response to regulatory challenges in renewable energy, and I expect that my results might hold across industries with emerging regulatory governance, where policies need to be updated continuously in collaboration with government to sustain long-term investment. So I'll get us started with an example of how things can go wrong. Now, in 2019, Colombia looked poised to lead energy transition and scale up quickly. The government had permitted around 6 gigawatts of solar and wind projects. Now, Colombia's total energy demand at peak is a little over 10 gigawatts. So this is a massive increase in energy capacity. Most of these contracts went to foreign companies from Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the like. And overall, it seemed like a very optimistic picture, per this news headline. However, as of 2023, things had changed. Per this less optimistic news headline, a large French company, Électricité de France, is leaving Colombia in the face of regulatory challenges. And EDF is one of many companies making this choice. Now, EDF ran into issues with the grid permitting process, experiencing long delays due to backed up permitting timelines. And again, this is one of many companies. A few examples I'll talk about more later include Norwegian companies, other Spanish and Italian utilities as well, all leaving the market. And this has dire consequences for both energy transition and energy security. Colombia was really counting on these energy projects to make up for lagging hydropower generation during this El Niño drought. This past summer, when I was in Bogota, the lack of solar energy projects meant that the government was forced to ration water, which I unfortunately experienced myself, to my surprise. And they were about half a percentage point of hydropower capacity away from rationing energy too. So in addition to failing to meet energy goals, Colombia only has about 1 gigawatt of solar online now, in contrast to the 6 gigawatts that should have been online. There's also broader implications for energy security as well. So Colombia is part of a broader pattern among countries relying on foreign investment. So this figure shows the rate of solar energy generation among low and middle income countries between 2000 and 2023. The blue curve shows the rate of solar scale up among countries where most of the firms are foreign. The red curve shows solar scale up where most of the investors are domestic. As you might notice, those countries relying on foreign firms scale up faster, but are plateauing in recent years, while those with more domestic investors are scaling up more slowly, yes, but at a constant rate of growth. So this figure motivates the pattern I aim to explain in the remainder of this presentation, which is what explains this divergence in the rate of solar generation in the global south. And again, I'll focus on how firms respond to regulatory challenges, in this case meaning that when things start to go wrong, your foreign investors might leave the market instead of working with government to improve policies. So first, I'll provide a little bit more flavor of the kinds of regulatory challenges that renewable energy investors run into in developing countries, but also these are challenges that apply to the world more broadly. I'll then lay out my theoretical framework, which aims to explain how firms make decisions when facing regulatory challenges. I'll then walk through a two-part empirical analysis, the first of which sketches out a broader relationships between investment and regulatory outcomes. And then I'll talk through a couple of case studies that trace how firms make decisions under regulatory uncertainty. But first, let's talk a little bit about the regulatory environment for renewable energy. Now, it's well established that policy stability through mechanisms like veto players and other domestic institutions that tie the hands of government are associated with more investment. However, in renewable energy, we actually need continuous regulatory reform. Renewables requires investment in new infrastructure, new technologies, and even new market models in order to keep growing. Renewable energy imposes technical constraints on existing energy infrastructure, so we need to keep updating policies to facilitate its growth. However, to complicate matters further, there are political obstacles to renewable energy investment. This is not just the fossil fuel industry, however. A robust body of scholarship focuses on how transmission companies, the companies that run the wires from solar panels off in the countryside to your house, face costs from integrating renewable energy into the grid and fight back. So I'll use a prominent example from Leah Stokes's work, if you're familiar, in the American Politics case, to illustrate how these companies go about fighting back. So in Arizona, the big utility, Arizona Public Services, has tried to pack state regulatory commissions. They've also spent almost $1 million on public relations campaigns slandering solar energy. And they've gone so far as to hire paid actors to speak out in public commission meetings about the evils of net energy metering. So all of this is to say that it's not just fossil fuels, it's transmission companies that are really getting in the way of the regulatory reforms necessary to sustain energy transition. But where do renewable energy firms come in? So there's been a fair amount of work focusing on how political coalitions are necessary to push for policy updates in energy transition. Now, I go one step further and argue that renewable energy investors are a critical part of this coalition. Why? Because they have private information about failures in the policymaking process that the government needs in order to update regulation. Governments can typically only observe delays in meeting solar energy targets, but they don't necessarily know why things have gone wrong. Renewable energy firms can tell the government, hey, we have our bank guarantee, our financing is under control. It's the grid operator that is delaying the issuance of contracts, refusing to sign contracts, and otherwise getting in the way of our projects coming online on time. But this raises a question of which firms stick around to work with governments in the face of these regulatory challenges. And political economy scholarship would argue that it's often large firms, which in the global south are typically foreign companies, that have the most influence over regulatory reform. We heard about this in the case of Malaysia yesterday, but a broader literature finds this pattern in issue areas like trade, international standards, and even campaign contributions in the United States. However, I argue that in renewable energy, patterns of firm influence depart from this logic. Why? Due to the structure of renewable energy governance. Renewable energy is a new sector, and governance is, as a result, split across existing domestic institutions, leading to a rather fragmented patchwork structure of regulation. As a result, due to this pattern of governance, I argue that size alone is not enough to buy influence. Firms need to know who to lobby, how to do it, and what to ask for in order to secure the regulatory reforms necessary to keep the energy transition on track. So I'll just give us a visual example of centralization and decentralization so we all are thinking along the same lines. So in Colombia, the coffee sector has long been a fundamental part of the country's economy. As a result, has a relatively structured or a centralized structure of governance. There's one main government agency, one main industry association, and a relatively linear structure of preference aggregation among firms. Renewable energy is different. There are several government agencies, several industry associations, even in the renewable energy sector, and it's often very confusing to identify which bureaucrats are in charge of which parts of the policymaking process. For example, the Ministry of Mines and Energy can have auctions to hand out solar contracts, but so can the planning agency that's also in charge of long-term transmission and distribution plans. So all of this is to say, it can be difficult to identify which bureaucrats to ask for which policy reforms, and it's sometimes even unclear what they can do about it. So this leads me to my theoretical framework. I argue that when faced with regulatory challenges, firms have a choice. They can exercise voice, tell the government what they need, try to pressure regulators to fix it, or they can exit the market, throw their hands up, and take their money somewhere else. I draw upon Hirschman's framework to argue that firms weigh the two and select whichever option incurs the fewest costs. On one hand, I expect that outside options, or the range of future investment possibilities, should determine the cost of exit, while on the other hand, due to the decentralized structure of renewable energy governance, embeddedness, not just size, determines firms' costs of lobbying. So let's unpack this in a little bit more detail. So first, outside options should reduce the cost of exit. For example, a large foreign multinational has invested in several places abroad. If things go wrong in Colombia, it's much easier to go somewhere it already has assets, for example, its home country. Second, these options further atrophy the development of the art of voice. This means that if I'm a large multinational and I know I have options somewhere else, I'll learn a little bit less about how to lobby where I am right now. Why would I bother learning about Colombian energy regulation if I already know how it works in Spain? On the other side of the scale, firms' embeddedness in social and economic structures shapes their cost of lobbying. Now, this operates through a couple of different channels. There are cultural dimensions to embeddedness, like a shared language or even a shared understanding of acceptable lobbying practices in a given market. There are also relational dimensions of this. For example, a large domestic business conglomerate has probably interacted with regulators before in other sectors of the economy, like acquiring land for a factory or having to obtain an electricity connection for a factory. This puts firms in touch with regulators so that when they invest in renewable energy, they already know who to call and how to ask for what they need. Now, this leads me to a couple of typical cases. On the one hand, most foreign firms will have relatively low exit costs. They have that international portfolio and can certainly go back to their home country if needed. On the other hand, they'll have a high cost of voice. In solar, as a new industry, most of these firms are new investors. This means that they don't necessarily know much about a given country's market structure, much less have personal connections to the bureaucrats in charge. On the other hand, most domestic firms will face rather high costs of exit. Many of these firms are rather small, and if they haven't invested abroad to begin with, it's pretty unlikely they're going to start with solar. On the other hand, they'll have a relatively low cost of voice, and this goes for small firms too. For example, in Colombia, one of the few small firms that's chugging along was in a renewable energy incubator with members of the Ministry of Mines and Energy. So when policies that affect this firm need some tweaking, they're able to call on their bureaucrat colleagues that they have those personal relationships with. And I think that this allows even small firms outsized influence over policy adoption relative to what existing theory might predict. Now, this leads me to a couple of testable implications. So first, I expect that countries with a higher share of domestic investment will adopt more renewable energy policies, again, indicative of this iterative regulatory reform we need, because in the face of regulatory challenges, these firms will lobby for regulatory reform. Foreign firms, on the other hand, will leave. So I use a mixed methods approach to evaluate this argument. First, we'll walk through a quantitative large N analysis using some original data on who owns the solar projects in the developing world. And then I'll talk through some of my interview evidence across 3 different cases that illustrate how firms make decisions under these regulatory challenges. So again, first, we'll look at high-level relationships between domestic firms and policy adoption. So here, I just use a regression analysis, and my independent variable is the share of solar capacity from domestic firms. I think that this captures the relative size of the domestic industry, but I also include robustness checks with the amount of solar, with the number of domestic firms in the solar industry and the number of projects owned by domestic firms in the solar industry for absolute values. My dependent variable here is the number of renewable energy policies adopted in the next period. And I use 3 different databases to measure this. They each have their own system of classifying renewable energy policy. And in addition to this, I implement robustness checks using a measure of renewable energy policy stringency from the World Bank. I'm not going to share those results here, but things are relatively consistent across different specifications. And control for the usual suspects like fossil fuel consumption, gross domestic product, democracy, trade, so on and so forth. And I use ordinary least squares regression with country and year fixed effects to get at how a change in the share of domestic investment, or change in the share of domestic investment corresponds with policy adoption. So on balance, regression results confirm my expected association between domestic investment share and solar energy policy adoption. So for a 1 unit increase in the share of domestic investment, we see about 10% more of a renewable energy policy, a modest but substantive effect given that most countries don't adopt that many policies. Between 2020 and 2023, most countries adopt around 10 policies total, so even 1 or 2 policies in a given year is a pretty big step. All right, so let's turn to the qualitative evidence. So here I've interviewed around 100 different actors in the electricity sector across 3 different cases. My cases range from high foreign investment to low shares of foreign investment. And this allows me to check a couple of important things. So first, I'm able to evaluate whether opposition to renewable energy is consistent across different types of country cases. And on balance, I find that grid operators, those transmission companies in Panama, are doing pretty similar things to grid operators in Malaysia. I'm also able to evaluate whether firm behavior is consistent across different types of cases. This is, of course, important for the generalizability of my argument. And indeed, I find that domestic firms in Panama, while they're not very as influential because there's such a small coalition relative to foreign companies, are attempting to mobilize in rather similar strategies, drawing on those informal connections, similar strategies to domestic firms in Malaysia. Of course, in Malaysia, they're going to be more influential because they're a much higher share of the domestic solar market. So again, here we'll be tracing how firms make decisions in the face of regulatory uncertainty. So first, I'll turn to the case of Malaysia, which is my case of domestic firms, local lobbying, and slow but steady renewable energy growth. So in Malaysia, the government began its solar energy journey very modestly. In the first few years, solar investment was limited to only domestic firms, and policies allowed about 100 megawatts of growth to come online in the first few years. So very slow in the beginning. These domestic firms faced lots of opposition from the utility incumbent TNB. TNB attempted to delay the issuance of solar permits, hoping that if they dragged their feet long enough, the small solar firms would just go away. That, fortunately, didn't happen. Small firms stuck together and lobbied the government for increasingly ambitious policies. Of course, sometimes policies were not perfect, but these firms worked over time instead of exiting the market, mostly because they can't leave Malaysia because they're small domestic firms, to improve policies. And this example illustrates the strength of domestic industry now. Per a bureaucrat at the Ministry of Energy and Water that I interviewed this summer in Malaysia, domestic firms are so loud that, with reference to a new policy creating a new market structure for solar energy, there was so much pressure from the solar industry that the government has to open up the grid. It's going to be challenging. It's going to fly in the face of existing policy choices. But the government has to do it because local solar firms are not going to go quietly into the night. They're going to fight for policy reform. And this has led Malaysia to implement a series of iterative policies, including feed-in tariffs, net metering, a couple of creative schemes for self-consumption to sidestep grid operator opposition, in addition to now 5 auction rounds for solar energy. They've got about 1 gigawatt of small-scale solar, a little over 2 gigawatts of solar from their auctions, and have just released more capacity for 2 gigs of solar from another very large-scale auction in the last few weeks. So, on the whole, Malaysia is a picture of slow but steady solar growth and iterative policy change. Colombia is a bit of a different story. The government adopted, as I said in the introduction, auctions for large-scale solar capacity that attracted these big foreign companies very quickly. However, they also quickly ran into problems with the grid operator, with delays in permitting, grid operators delaying the issuance of permits again. It's one of their favorite strategies. But unfortunately, foreign firms are not working with the government to improve things. This quote from a former regulator illustrates the behavior of a large Chinese firm, Trina Solar, which signed one of these auction contracts, but in the face of delays, told the government that they can't honor that contract anymore and they're leaving the market. This echoes the behavior of other firms like EDF and a Norwegian firm that I interviewed, which is going so far as to sell all of its contracts in Colombia and get out of the country because the CEOs back in Europe are not okay with the delays and they're not going to stick around to help the government fix things. And this has dire implications for energy transition and, again, energy security. Colombia's power pipeline is shrinking. The government has issued contracts for about 20 gigawatts of renewable energy at this point. And in the last year, this has been cut in half as companies have exited the market. The government actually doesn't know how much solar will come online because they don't have a mechanism to track this, unfortunately. So this power pipeline could keep shrinking as foreign firms take signals from each other and keep exiting the market. So again, it's very critical that firms work together to improve policy rather than leaving when the going gets tough. Now, where does this leave us? The main takeaway that I want to leave us with today is that local firms will lobby for regulatory reform, but foreign firms with their outside options are likely to exit the market facing these regulatory challenges. And this is very important, especially in light of some new data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which shows that the global renewable energy pipeline is actually shrinking as grid bottlenecks take hold in some markets. This means that issues around transmission and distribution build-out are getting in the way of renewable energy expansion, and instead of working with governments to improve policy, firms are just reducing their projected renewable energy investment pipeline. Now, in terms of policy solutions around how to fix this, I think one way forward is to promote collaboration between foreign and domestic companies to make the most of that foreign capital and local expertise. However, there's a problem. Most domestic firms do not have the capacities from the get-go to partner with large foreign companies on these big solar projects. They just don't have the experience. So we can't just expect collaboration to happen on its own. I think that as a way forward, promoting capacity building in these countries to get domestic firms up to speed to partner with foreign companies will be a critical part of the energy transition going forward and open up opportunities for regulatory reform with foreign capital to build those large-scale projects that we all really need. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So before opening the floor, I just want to ask you a very quick question. Please. I think it's very interesting, your framework of combining this cost of voice and the cost of exit. And I wanted to ask, within this framework, the optimal policy based on the government best response, knowing the incentive structure that for some firms is very expensive to exit the market, does this suggest that you should not provide incentives and investments and subsidies for the firms with a low cost of exit, because those firms are gonna exit anyway? I mean, let me take a step back. So if a firm has a very high cost of exit, you don't want to subsidize that firm because
it'll have to stick around.
Right, that's going to stick around. So is that the policy recommendation that you think? So in a way, there's like a bargain between government and firms, and the outside options would be sort of the threat points on this bargain.
Right. So I think it's tricky, and that subsidies alone for foreign investors won't fix things entirely, because ultimately the reforms that we need to allow more renewable energy capacity to come online are like system level. You can't just increase incentives for one firm and expect the problem to go away. We need investment in transmission and distribution build out, and those incumbent utility providers don't want to do it. And so it's ultimately a matter of getting firms involved in the policymaking process so that they can tell the government, hey, like grid capacity is really low in this part of the country, and there's a bunch of us that want to get in on the market. So it's a system level problem. So I think that's the real challenge here.
Great. Questions? Okay. Gustavo, Eric, and 3 more, and then we see if we have more time for additional questions.
Hi. Very cool talk. Thanks a lot. I'm wondering here if your insight applies broadly to any type of new technology. Because what your kind of insight is suggesting to me is that any sort of new technology that's developed outside of the local economy, in which there is no local representative of that technology, would have difficulties in integrating to that country because there is no regulatory system for it? Thank you.
Okay, I'll just take that quickly. My answer is going to sound very similar to what I just said, because I think so. One, the decentralized sort of structure of governance problem should apply to most new technologies. But two, the policy solutions necessary for renewables are really at the system level. So for some industries, maybe giving the foreign company a little bit more money will help them stick around. But I think for renewables, it's the systemic nature of the regulatory reform that really complicates things and creates that need for local firms. So I'll have to think more about where that system level regulatory reform is necessary. But I think that's kind of an important scope condition.
Eric?
Yeah, so this is interesting. In some other countries I know about, not so much renewables, but domestic firms complain a lot about the special treatment that the foreign firms get. They're getting, right, the foreign firms are getting all sort of special, dispensations. And so this is an interesting contrast. But it makes me wonder, I think it seems an interpretation is that the local firms might be getting preferential treatment on some dimensions that the foreign firms are not getting. And is that a good thing or not? It's sort of, I'm getting the vibe that's a good thing, and MNCs are bad, and they're footloose, but maybe it's more of a crony, sort of a cozy relationship domestically.
Interesting question. So absolutely, I think protecting the local industry forever is not the way. Now, what's very interesting is that even among countries that protected the local industry from the get-go, like Malaysia, only domestic firms for the first 5 years, those domestic firms actually want foreign capital now that they're big enough to partner with them. There's some interesting work in political economy that makes this case at a broader level from Sarah Dansman. So I think I'm actually perhaps less concerned if we protect local firms. They're always going to want protection. I think that at a certain point, they're going to want that foreign capital so that they can build even bigger projects. So valid concern. Perhaps I'm, not so worried.
So I have time for one more question, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two very small questions. One is, this is a structural problem, and it possibly regards the difficulties of developing or emerging markets to access the capital market to finance the grid transformation. So maybe it's independent of the firms getting in or not. If the countries can't get the money to transform the grid, the firms could lobby as much as they want. They will never pay for the grid. That's my first question. The second one is it possible that in the end the headquarters at home just say, we don't give a damn, move out, whereas the people in the countries, like in Colombia, they really know what's going on, and they know what they would have to do. It's just that the guys in Spain say, no, get out. So is there a headquarter dependency dynamic here? Thank you.
Yeah, I think grid finance is definitely a constraint. There are various models for financing that build out, many of which involve imposing taxes on consumers. So I think certainly opening up international finance for grid expansion could help alleviate some of this problem. Otherwise, countries, firms can lobby the government to impose costs on consumers, and it's a hard sell. And then in terms of headquarters, I do think there's kind of this balance between whether embeddedness or outside options matters more here. And I think certainly in some cases, it could be that headquarters knows it's going to take a lot of time and it's going to take a lot of effort to get the government up to speed on grid reform. And so they just choose to pull the trigger and get out. So worth considering for theoretical precision. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.